Medmenham, Buckinghamshire, England. November 28, 1943. The stereoscope sat on the desk like a Victorian relic, two eyepieces mounted above a wooden frame, innocent as a child's toy. Through those lenses, Flight Officer Constance Babington Smith had spent the last 6 hours staring at death rendered in shades of grey. She blinked hard, her eyes burning from the strain, and reached for the cup of tea that had gone cold 3 hours ago. Outside Danesfield House, a Tudor mansion requisitioned by the Royal Air Force and rechristened RAF Medmenham, November rain drummed against leaded windows that had watched the Thames flow past for centuries. Inside, beneath vaulted ceilings and ornate plasterwork, the largest photographic interpretation operation in history hummed with quiet urgency. It was 4:17 in the afternoon. In 7 minutes, Constance Babington Smith would spot something less than a millimeter long on a photograph taken from 30,000 feet. That microscopic detail would unravel months of German secrecy, expose Hitler's plan to annihilate London with pilotless aircraft, and trigger the largest bombing campaign aimed at a single weapon system in the entire war. But she didn't know that yet. Right now, she was just tired, frustrated, and running out of places to look. The photograph before her showed Peenemund, a research station on Germany's Baltic coast. Squadron leader John Merrifield had brought it back that morning, flying his de Havilland Mosquito at near-suicidal altitudes over heavily defended airspace. The Mosquito was painted in a special blue that made it nearly invisible at dawn and dusk. It carried no guns, no bombs, just cameras. 5 cameras, actually, arranged to capture overlapping images that, when viewed through a stereoscope, created a 3-dimensional picture of enemy territory. The pilots called these missions milk runs because you couldn't fight back, couldn't do anything except fly straight and level while German flak batteries tried to blow you out of the sky. Merrifield had come back with his aircraft peppered with shrapnel holes and film magazines containing what might be the most important photographs of the war. Constance had been briefed to look for something specific. Anything queer, the orders said. Look for anything queer. It was the kind of instruction that would drive a lesser analyst to despair, but Constance Babington Smith wasn't a lesser analyst. At 31 years old, she had already established herself as one of the most skilled aircraft interpreters in the Allied intelligence apparatus. Her path to this moment had been circuitous. Born into British upper-class privilege, she was the 7th of 9 children, granddaughter of a Viceroy of India, great-great-granddaughter of the man who acquired the Elgin marbles. Her father died when she was 10. The expectation was that she would marry well, manage a household, disappear into the comfortable anonymity expected of women of her class. Instead, she discovered aviation. Brooklands Aerodrome was near her family home in Weybridge, and she began watching the air races as an escape from caring for her ailing mother. The machines fascinated her. Not the romance of flight, the mechanics. The way a wing generated lift, the relationship between engine power and airframe design, the evolution of aircraft as weapons of war. She began writing articles for the Aeroplane magazine under the byline Babs. Her technical knowledge and eye for detail caught the attention of people who mattered. When war broke out in 1939, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force came calling. The training was brutal. Photographic interpretation wasn't about looking at pictures. It was about understanding three-dimensional reality from two-dimensional images, about recognizing patterns invisible to untrained eyes, about making deductions from shadows and textures and the subtle ways human activity marked the landscape. The instructors brought in archaeologists, geologists, architects, anyone who understood how to read terrain. Constance discovered she had a gift for it. More than a gift, a kind of supernatural ability to see what others missed. By December 1940, she was at Medmenham, assigned to set up an aircraft interpretation section. The unit had started with 114 officers and 117 other ranks. By 1943, it had swollen to over 1,700 people working around the clock in the mansion and in Nissen huts that had sprouted across the grounds like metal mushrooms. The scale was staggering. During preparations for the Normandy invasion, 7 million prints per month passed through Medmenham for interpretation. 7 million. The photo interpreters, PIs as they called themselves, provided 80% of British intelligence during the war. Everything from bomb damage assessment to tracking German naval movements to identifying camouflaged airfields. And now, finding Hitler's secret weapons. The rumors had started in March 1943. 2 German generals, captured in North Africa and held at Trent Park military prison, didn't know their conversations were being recorded. British intelligence had bugged the entire facility. The generals discussed a new weapon, a rocket that would target England and change the course of the war. At first, intelligence officers dismissed it as propaganda or wishful thinking. Then the reconnaissance photographs started coming in from Piedmont. Something was being built there. Something big. The first photographs from May showed 3 large concrete circles beside a new airfield. Nobody could identify what they were. One analyst suggested sewage treatment. The photographs were shelved. But the intelligence kept accumulating. Radio intercepts. Reports from resistance networks in occupied Europe. References to Vergeltungswaffen, revenge weapons. The code names were V1 and V2. Hitler was building something, and he was building it at Piedmont. In August 1943, the RAF launched Operation Hydra, a massive bombing raid on Piedmont. 600 bombers, 1,800 tons of explosives, one of the largest single-target raids of the war. The attack killed scientists, destroyed laboratories, set the German program back months. But it didn't stop it. The Germans moved production underground, into mountains where bombs couldn't reach. And they started building something else. Launch sites. Lots of them. In northern France. By November, Allied intelligence had identified 96 sites under construction. Distinctive ski-shaped ramps, concrete structures, storage bunkers. They were called ski sites because of the curved shape visible from the air. But nobody knew exactly what they were launching. The V-2 rocket had been identified in June by another interpreter named André Kenny. He'd spotted 2 massive rockets lying horizontally on transporter vehicles at Piedmont. They were 14 meters tall when stood upright. 14 meters. You could measure that from the shadow in the photographs, if you knew what you were doing. But there was something else. Something smaller. Intelligence suggested a pilotless aircraft, a flying bomb propelled by some kind of jet engine. Churchill's scientific advisor, Lord Charwell, insisted it was impossible. The Germans didn't have the technology. It had to be a hoax, a deception to waste Allied resources. But the evidence kept mounting. On November 13, Constance had been briefed specifically. Look for aircraft at Peenemund that might be pilotless. Look for anything smaller than the rockets. Look for anything that doesn't make sense. She adjusted the stereoscope and bent forward again. The photograph showed a section of Peenemund's testing grounds. When viewed through the stereoscope, the flat image acquired depth, became three-dimensional, almost tactile. You could measure the height of buildings from their shadows, identify vehicles from the way light reflected off their surfaces, spot recent construction from disturbed earth. Constance had trained herself to read photographs the way a musician reads sheet music. Automatically, instinctively, seeing patterns and anomalies without conscious thought. She scanned methodically. Left to right, top to bottom. The reconnaissance aircraft had photographed the site at a shallow angle, capturing details that vertical shots would miss. She could see buildings, storage sheds, vehicles. Nothing unusual. Nothing queer. Her eyes tracked across a section of forest, then onto an open area. And there it was. A launching ramp. She'd seen dozens of photographs of the ski sites in France, so she recognized the shape immediately. But this one was different. This one had something on it. A tiny cruciform shape, sitting on rails, looking like a stunted aircraft. The entire object measured less than a millimeter on the photograph. With a 20-foot wingspan in reality, based on rough calculations from the scale. Constance sat back. Her heart was racing, but her hands were steady. She'd been doing this work long enough to know the difference between seeing something and proving you'd seen something. She needed verification. She needed measurements. She needed to rule out every other possibility before she reported this to anyone. She spent the next hour going over the photograph with a magnifying glass, checking and rechecking. The object had wings. Definite wings, cruciform configuration. It was positioned on the ramp as if ready for launch. The angle of the image allowed her to estimate dimensions. Roughly 20 feet across, maybe 25 feet long. Too small to carry a pilot. The proportions were all wrong for a conventional aircraft. This was something new. At 5:34 p.m., Constance walked down the hall to find her immediate superior. She carried the photograph and her notes. Her voice was calm when she explained what she'd found, but inside she was electric with certainty. This was it. This was what they'd been searching for. The V-1 flying bomb. Hitler's pilotless terror weapon. And she was the first person outside Germany to actually see one. The response was immediate and massive. Other PIs were pulled from their assignments to search through months of archived photographs from Peenemund. If there was one P-20, as they started calling it, there might be more. Within days, they'd identified several more of the small aircraft in various stages of testing. Some on ramps, some in storage, some apparently in flight, captured by the camera at the moment of launch. Each discovery added detail to the picture. The V-1 was a cruise missile, essentially. A jet-powered flying bomb, designed to be launched from ground ramps toward targets in England. And the launch sites in France, the 96 ski sites they've been monitoring, those weren't for the V-2 rockets. They were for these. For swarms of pilotless aircraft carrying explosive warheads, fired at London and other cities by the hundreds or thousands. Intelligence estimates suggested the Germans hoped to launch 2,000 per day once the system was fully operational. 2,000 flying bombs per day, each carrying a ton of high explosive. The potential for devastation was almost unimaginable. The intelligence reached Churchill on November 30th. The Prime Minister had been skeptical of the V-weapon threat, largely because Lord Cherwell had convinced him it was either exaggerated or impossible. But the photographs didn't lie. Constance Babington Smith had found definitive proof that Hitler's revenge weapons were real, and they were nearly ready for deployment. Churchill's response was characteristically decisive. Operation Crossbow, already underway as a general campaign against German long-range weapons, was expanded and given top priority. Starting December 5, 1943, Allied bomber forces began systematically attacking the ski sites in northern France. The code name for the targets was No-Ball, followed by a number. No-Ball 27, No-Ball 93, and so on through all 96 sites. The bombing campaign was massive. RAF Bomber Command and the U.S. 8th Air Force flew thousands of sorties. Heavy Lancasters for night raids beat 26 Marauders for precision daylight attacks. By the end of December, 54 sites had been attacked and 7 completely destroyed. The bombing continued relentlessly. By March 1944, all 96 sites had been hit, some multiple times. The damage forced the Germans to completely redesign their launch system. The ski sites were too obvious, too vulnerable. German engineers developed a new approach, modular sites called Belhamelin systems, named after the first one Allied intelligence discovered. These could be assembled quickly from prefabricated components that looked like farm buildings. A site could be set up, used for a few launches, then disassembled and moved within 24 hours. Hidden in forests, camouflaged as ordinary structures, they were nearly impossible to detect from the air. But Constance and her fellow PIs adapted. They learned to recognize the scorch marks on grass and earth where the V-1's pulse jet engine had fired during launch. They identified supply routes, storage depots, the characteristic patterns of activity around active sites. The work was exhausting. 12-hour shifts became standard. Constance often worked longer, driven by the knowledge that every launch site they identified was one less source of death raining down on London. The first V-1 attack came on June 13, 1944, 1 week after D-Day. The Germans fired from their mobile launch sites, the ones that had survived Operation Crossbow. Over the following months, nearly 10,000 V-1s were launched toward England. About 4,000 reached their targets. The rest were shot down by fighters, destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, or crashed due to mechanical failures. The V-1 offensive killed over 6,000 people and injured 18,000 more. It was devastating. But it could have been so much worse. If Constance Babington Smith hadn't spotted that tiny cruciform object on a photograph from 30,000 feet, if Operation Crossbow hadn't destroyed or damaged most of the permanent launch sites, if the Germans had been able to implement their original plan of mass launches from hardened positions, the casualties would have been catastrophic. Some estimates suggest that a fully operational V-1 campaign, launched from the 96 ski sites as originally planned, could have killed tens of thousands and potentially disrupted the entire Normandy invasion. The psychological impact alone would have been enormous. Imagine living in London in June 1944, knowing that pilotless aircraft were being fired at your city by the hundreds every day, arriving without warning, impossible to predict or avoid. The terror would have been paralyzing. But Operation Crossbow had disrupted the system enough that the V-1 became a terrible nuisance rather than a war-winning weapon. Constance's discovery didn't end with the V-1. She was also responsible for identifying the Me-163 Comet, a rocket-powered interceptor that could climb to altitude faster than any Allied aircraft. She spotted scorch marks on the runway at Piedmont, proof that the Germans had developed a twin-engine jet fighter, the Me-262. Every discovery added to the intelligence mosaic, helping Allied commanders understand what they were facing and how to counter it. Her work didn't go unrecognized. She was mentioned in dispatches in 1942, awarded the MBE, Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, in 1945. After Victory in Europe Day, she was attached to U.S. Air Force Intelligence in Washington, D.C., continuing her photo interpretation work for the Pacific Theater. In 1946, she received the U.S. Legion of Merit, the first British woman to earn that honor. But recognition was never what drove her. In interviews after the war, Constance was characteristically modest about her achievements. She described photo interpretation as a collaborative effort, emphasized the contributions of her colleagues, downplayed her own role. She talked about the importance of patience, attention to detail, the ability to think laterally about what photographs might reveal. What she rarely discussed was the pressure. The knowledge that lives depended on the accuracy of her analysis. The exhaustion of staring through a stereoscope for 14 hours a day, every day, for months on end. The frustration when photographs were poor quality or weather obscured key features. The terrible responsibility of distinguishing signal from noise when the signal might be a weapon capable of killing thousands. After the war, Constance returned to journalism. She worked as a researcher for Life magazine, wrote several books including her own biography of the British photo reconnaissance effort titled Evidence in Camera. She authored biographies of other remarkable people, including her cousin, writer Rose Macaulay. She became a founding director of the de Havilland Museum Trust, honoring the Mosquito aircraft that had made so much of the reconnaissance work possible. She never married. She lived quietly, wrote extensively, maintained connections with the intelligence community. When the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency in the United States established its Analysis Fusion Cell, they named it after Constance Babington Smith. The facility where modern imagery analysts do their work carries her name, a permanent tribute to the woman who proved that painstaking attention to detail could change the course of history. She died on July 31, 2000, at the age of 87. Her obituaries focused on her discovery of the V-1, as they should. But they often missed the broader significance of what she represented. Constance Babington Smith was operating in a world that had very specific expectations for women of her class and generation. She was supposed to be decorative, deferential, domestic. Instead, she became one of the most formidable intelligence analysts of the Second World War, working in a field that barely existed when the war started. The detail no reconnaissance unit was trained to notice wasn't really about the V-1. It was about the assumption that significant intelligence work required formal training, masculine authority, conventional expertise. Constance brought none of those things. She brought journalism's eye for the newsworthy incident, an aviator's understanding of aircraft design, and an almost supernatural ability to see patterns in chaos. She brought patience, persistence, and the willingness to spend hour after hour staring at tiny details that might mean nothing or might mean everything. The stereoscope she used sits in a museum now, a relic of a different era of intelligence gathering. Modern imagery analysts use satellites, digital sensors, computer-aided analysis systems that would seem like science fiction to the PIs at Medmenham. But the fundamental skill remains the same. The ability to look at information everyone else has access to and see what everyone else has missed. The patience to search when you don't know what you're searching for. The judgment to recognize significance in details that seem trivial. That's what Constance Babington Smith had. That's what she used on November 28, 1943, when she spotted a cruciform object less than a millimeter long on a photograph and understood, instantly and completely, what it meant. A reconnaissance pilot had risked his life to capture that image. Thousands of analysts at Medmenham were searching through millions of photographs. But it took one person, with the right combination of knowledge and intuition, to see the detail that mattered. The V-1 flying bomb was Hitler's attempt to terrorize Britain into submission, to demonstrate that German technological superiority could overcome conventional military disadvantage. It represented thousands of hours of engineering work, millions of Reichsmarks in development costs, the labor of concentration camp prisoners forced to build the weapons in underground factories. It was supposed to be Germany's secret advantage, the weapon that would turn the tide of the war. Instead, it became a case study in how intelligence defeats technology. How one analyst, working with a Victorian-era viewing device in a requisition mansion in the English countryside, could unravel months of secrecy and trigger a bombing campaign that neutralized a weapon system before it reached full operational capacity. Constance Babington Smith didn't stop the V-1. Thousands of them still fell on London and other cities. But she gave the Allies time to prepare, time to disrupt the launch infrastructure, time to develop countermeasures. The detail no recon unit was trained to notice turned out to be the detail that mattered most. A tiny aircraft on a launching ramp, captured by accident on a photograph taken for completely different purposes. Constance saw it because she'd trained herself to see everything, to assume that any anomaly might be significant, to trust her judgment even when conventional wisdom said otherwise. In the end, that's what intelligence work really is. Not elaborate spy networks or high-tech surveillance systems, though those have their place. It's individuals with specific skills, applied to specific problems, making connections that aren't obvious until someone makes them. It's the geologist who recognizes terrain features that indicate underground construction. The architect who understands how buildings reveal their function through their form. The journalist who knows how to distinguish the newsworthy incident from background noise. Constance Babington Smith was all of those things. She was also something else, something harder to quantify. She had the courage to trust her own eyes, to make definitive statements based on fragments of evidence, to stand by her analysis even when senior officials were skeptical. That kind of confidence doesn't come from training. It comes from knowing that you've done the work, checked every angle, ruled out every alternative explanation. It comes from being right often enough that your judgment carries weight. On November 28, 1943, she was right. The cruciform object on the launching ramp was exactly what she thought it was. Hitler's secret weapon, exposed by patient analysis and extraordinary vision. The detail no recon unit was trained to notice became the detail that helped save London from destruction, that contributed to the success of D-Day, that demonstrated the value of careful intelligence work in modern warfare. Constance would probably have been embarrassed by that level of praise. She'd have pointed out that she was just doing her job, that any competent PI would have spotted the same thing, that the real heroes were the reconnaissance pilots who risked their lives every day. That modesty was part of what made her effective. She never let ego interfere with analysis, never assumed she was smarter than the evidence, never stopped looking just because she'd found something interesting. Those are lessons worth remembering. In a world of instant communication and overwhelming information, the ability to sift through noise and identify signal has never been more important. The tools have changed. The stereoscope has given way to satellite imagery and machine learning algorithms. But the fundamental skill, the capacity to notice what others miss, to recognize patterns in chaos, to make meaning from fragments, that skill is timeless. Constance Babington Smith had it. She used it to help win a war. And she did it all while working in a field that didn't fully acknowledge women's contributions, in a society that had very specific ideas about women's capabilities, in conditions that would have broken less determined people. The tiny cruciform object she spotted on a photograph wasn't just a V-1 flying bomb. It was proof that intelligence, persistence, and the courage to trust your own judgment could change history. If this story about Constance Babington Smith and her remarkable discovery moved you, if it made you think differently about how wars are won and the kinds of courage that don't make headlines, please hit that like button. Every like helps us bring more forgotten stories like this to people who need to hear them. Subscribe to Override War and turn on notifications. We're rescuing these stories from dusty archives and bringing them back to life, one incredible true account at a time. These are real people who did extraordinary things, and they deserve to be remembered. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in London, where the V1s fell? In the United States, where Constance received the Legion of Merit? Somewhere else in the world? Our community spans the globe, and every comment helps this story reach more people. And if there are other stories from World War II you'd like us to cover, other forgotten heroes whose contributions should be remembered, tell us in the comments. We read every single one, and your suggestions help shape what we research next. Thank you for watching, thank you for caring about history, and thank you for helping ensure that people like Constance Babington Smith, who changed the world with patience and precision, are never forgotten. The detail no recon unit was trained to notice turned out to be the detail that saved thousands of lives. That's worth remembering.